The election of 1824 saw the end of the Virginia dynasties. This was the first election in which no founding fathers were running. Instead, you had four prominent and not so prominent politicians of the early 1800s. Early favorites included Crawford, someone who'd been serving in Congress for several years, Henry Clay, our famous negotiator / compromiser from the Missouri Compromise, and really the favorite representative of the growing Western population. John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams and Secretary of State to President Monroe. And finally, up and coming, unexpected, out of the pack, our friend, General Andrew Jackson. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want to take a look at this electoral map. With four candidates, it's always going to be close. Take a minute. Who do you think would win this election just based off of this electoral map? John Quincy Adams, represented by that light pink color, Andrew Jackson by the green, Crawford by the blue, and Henry Clay by the orange. Obviously, Clay and Crawford are not serious threats, even with some big states. In fact, it looks like Jackson should have an easy victory. Not only do we see a great deal of this map in his color, green, but he wins 43% of the popular vote. 43%. But somehow he only wins 38% of the electoral vote. Remember, most states vote as a block. So even if you win more people, if you don't win an entire state, you don't get all of their electoral votes. The result of this is that John Quincy Adams is going to win the election because it's going to be thrown to the House of Representatives. Remember, we saw this with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. If there aren't enough electoral votes to win an election, the House of Representatives gets to vote. Many assumed, including Jackson, that the reason John Quincy Adams was able to win was a backroom deal made between himself and Henry Clay. Henry Clay, then a prominent member of the House of Representatives, throws his support and all of his votes behind John Quincy Adams in exchange for the position of Secretary of State. At the time, Secretary of State was thought to be the job that you got before you became president. JQA was the Secretary of State to President James Monroe. Monroe was the Secretary of State to President Madison. Madison was the Secretary of State to President Jefferson. You get the idea. This was the position that helped you practice being president. However, in the election of 1828, we see not Henry Clay, because he is still serving as Adams' Secretary of State, but John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson. So John Quincy Adams is the son of our second president, John Adams, and he is very much the child of privilege. He was very educated, first by Abigail Adams and the Adams family as they moved around on different diplomatic missions. Then he enters Harvard and gets that very New England education, as well as practicing law. He is going to serve several presidents from George Washington to President Monroe, ending that part of his career as Monroe's Secretary of State, and generally serves as someone who is well known in Washington in a number of roles. Jackson is almost his polar opposite. Although he's well known for his military heroics, both in the Battle of New Orleans and fighting Native Americans in Florida and on the western frontier, Jackson is very, very much a stereotypical Westerner. Raised in a log cabin, no formal education, rough and tumble, old hickory Andrew Jackson. However, Jackson has had 4 years to establish his identity as a political outsider. You see a lot of presidential candidates using now, "Oh, I'm not a Washington insider, I'm not a Washington fat cat." Jackson is pretty much the original person to use that line, and it pays off. Look how much of this map has turned Andrew Jackson yellow. So he and his new Democratic Party win the presidency in 1828, and this is the foundation of our two-party Democrat and Republican platform. First thing that Jackson does when he gets to office is he starts assigning his own people into office in what becomes known as the spoil system. Now, the spoil system wasn't anything totally new, and certainly it will continue well into today. You want to appoint political allies to important government jobs, but this will be something that is really used against Jackson by his enemies, because many of the people that he replaces have held office for 20, 30 years. So remember, the spoil system, you hire political allies, people that supported you during the election, to do government jobs. And Jackson's going to create this rationale. First, it rotates offices. You don't want the same person serving in their job for 30 years. That leads to laziness, that leads to incompetence. But it also helped him because he knew he could rely on people that would support his agenda, his ideas. And since he had been elected for those ideas, isn't it right that he appoints people who would support them? That's only doing the will of the American people. The other thing that Jackson's going to do that's going to be a little bit controversial in terms of appointing people and where he gets his advice is the creation of something called the Kitchen Cabinet. Now, the Kitchen Cabinet is created on the back of something known as the Eaton Affair or the Petticoat Affair. Jackson was friends with someone named John Henry Eaton, who is a senator and later goes on to become one of Jackson's advisors. Now, Eaton does something scandalous. He marries a widower himself. He marries a widow without really waiting for what was considered at the time a proper mourning period. And more than that, she wasn't really anything of consequence. Her family owned a boarding house, a hotel in D.C. So this was a pretty scandalous marriage. Many women of Washington's elite, including Jackson's vice president, Calhoun, his wife, kicked the new Mrs. Eaton out of all of their social circles. They were not having anything to do with her. Jackson didn't like this, and why he got involved in what was considered women's politics in D.C. comes down to a scandal of his own. His wife, who had passed away from the stress of his first two campaigns, passed away arguably from stress from allegations that were very similar to this. People said, oh, Jackson married someone who was already legally married. So Jackson sympathized with Mrs. Eaton, and he stopped listening to the advice of people who had been against her, including his vice president, John C. Calhoun. And he creates instead a group of advisors known as the Kitchen Cabinet. The Kitchen Cabinet is unofficial advisors, politicians, but also non-politicians like newspaper editors that Jackson would frequently meet with for their advice. Now, this insulted Vice President Calhoun. It insulted many other members of Washington's elite, and it snubbed people that were seen as experts, and it showed that he could be very petty with his political appointments. So between the spoil system and the Kitchen Cabinet, Jackson was not off to a great start with the people who are already in Washington. We call them today Washington insiders. And he continues to fight against this group by attacking an institution known as the National Bank. And we've seen the National Bank before. We've seen the National Bank as the major point of contention between Jefferson and Hamilton in the Federalist Democratic-Republican fight. Jackson disliked the bank for a lot of the same reasons that Jefferson did. It's elitist, it gives money to only the wealthy, how can poor people get access to this, and it's going to create something known as corporations. Sound familiar? This idea that the rich people can build huge conglomerates of equally wealthy people in order to get what they want. So Jackson thinks the bank is undemocratic, it gives power to unelected businessmen, and again, enriching the wealthy at the expense of the poor. So Jackson vetoes the congressional bill to recharter the bank. He says, I don't want this bank to continue. Even though it has been passed by Congress, I am vetoing it. Again, that checks and balances. He takes all of the government money out of the National Bank and he deposits it to the state bank. Again, the state banks know better how to deal with this. It makes the national government too big. We've seen these arguments before said by Thomas Jefferson. However, there were economic consequences. In 1837, there was a financial panic because the National Bank was responsible for controlling the currency. So there will be a huge amount of inflation after the charter is canceled. There's going to be mass unemployment as people can't get nationally backed loans, and things like cotton prices will fall. So it hurts people that it was not intended to hurt. Jackson may have been able to weather this storm if there weren't some other economic crises to deal with. The big one is the nullification crisis. So there is an economic policy in the United States of imposing tariffs. These are taxes on goods that are imported into the country, that are brought into the country from other countries. Northerners love them because they encourage people to buy American-made goods. Most American-made goods at this time period are made or manufactured in the North. Southerners did not like these tariffs because they want to trade their cotton in exchange for European goods, and that makes those manufactured good prices more competitive if there are no tariffs. So South Carolina says, we don't want these goods, we think they're bad for our economy, we are going to nullify or cancel the tariff. They're going to say it's unconstitutional and we are not going to enforce it in the state of South Carolina. This is a very Articles of Confederation problem, right? A state doesn't like something the national government is going to do, they're just not going to follow that law. Jackson had originally been very sympathetic to the Southerners. He's a Westerner, he knows what it's like for the Northerners to try to hurt the Southern economy to help themselves, but he does not like the idea of nullification because it starts to break apart the Union. So he gets Congress to pass the Force Act, and that authorizes him to enforce the tariff with military force. He can bring in national troops to force South Carolina to follow the law, because he says nullification, or canceling a law, is unconstitutional. The point of the Constitution is to keep the country together. We have our National Supremacy Clause that was confirmed by the Supreme Court. South Carolina needs to follow the law, and Jackson will use troops to do it. Now, this does not make South Carolinians very happy. And who is the foremost leader of South Carolina? Vice President Calhoun. So Calhoun will resign his position. He will leave his position as vice president and go back to being a senator from South Carolina because he believes that that is the only way to represent South Carolina's interest. Jackson has made an enemy of John C. Calhoun. The final act that we're going to talk about is the way Jackson treated the Native Americans. Jackson had fought the Native Americans in Florida and on the western frontier, but he had also been helped by the Native Americans. And so when it comes time to come up with a policy, it's not clear which way he's going to go until he actually signs the law. And that law is the Indian Removal Act. So you can kind of see from the wording that they are pushing them out of their land. And what they're ultimately going to do is the U.S. government is going to exchange land west of the Mississippi River for Native American land east of the Mississippi River. So to the U.S. government, it's a straight land exchange. So what makes the land that the Native Americans are currently on east of the Mississippi River so valuable? The answer is what it usually is in this period in history: gold. Gold. The American dream. Remember, this is before the gold rush in California. This is a point where they haven't discovered what British settlers came to Jamestown for over 100 years prior to this date. They haven't found gold. And it's not enough that it's on Native American land. They want it to be on land controlled by the United States. And this is a big initiative by the Georgian government. Of course, the Native Americans don't want to move. So the Cherokee are not going to take this lying down. They're going to take their case to the Supreme Court of the United States because as far as they're concerned, they own this land. The Chief Justice at the time, John Marshall, agrees. He says, the Cherokee Nation is a distinct community, occupying its own territory in which the laws of Georgia can have no force. So, does it matter that Georgia has passed a law moving the Native Americans? Not according to John Marshall. And he emphasizes it again, and which the citizens of Georgia have no right to enter. He really tries to create a distinction, almost like a foreign country, between Native American territory and United States territory. Unfortunately, for the Native Americans and for John Marshall, Jackson has shown in the past that he sides with the national government when it is convenient for him, and he sides with the state government when it is convenient for him. And this is another one of those times. He responds to John Marshall's decision, his Supreme Court decision, saying, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. What does that mean? He's referring back to the separation of powers. The Constitution gives the judicial branch the right to interpret laws, but it gives them no power to enforce laws. The executive branch has the power to enforce laws. And Jackson has decided, I'm not going to enforce Marshall's decision. I'm going to enforce the Indian Removal Act. This leads to the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears is the forced relocation of 5 southeastern tribes, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole, to Oklahoma, that land west of the Mississippi River. It's called the Trail of Tears for not during the time, but it is going to be called it afterwards based on the over 4,000 Native Americans that die during this forced relocation march. And it's interesting to read accounts of this march because not only the Native Americans themselves, but the white soldiers who are forcing this relocation write of the horrors and injustices on this march. So part of this answer to question C is a summary, right? What have we just seen with the Supreme Court decision and the Trail of Tears in kind of the response? The Cherokee are the ones with this more, according to the Americans at least, civilized response. Because they're the ones with their own alphabet, with their own constitution, they're going to respond going through legal and recognized channels. And obviously it does not work as well even after the Supreme Court declares their sovereignty. They are not, the Cherokee in particular, are not going to necessarily respond with violence, and neither are the Choctaw. Where you see responses with violence come from primarily the Seminoles. And the Seminoles are recognized today as a group that never formally relinquishes, never formally gives up their land or signs a peace treaty. We end up fighting a series of wars known as the Seminole Wars with this particular group. But ultimately they all feel the same way, that this is our land, this is our ancestors' land, and we're going to do what we need to do to protect it for all that works for them. All right, on that note, and I realize that's a bit of a biased note, I want you to respond to the question at the end of your notes. I want you to think about both the things that Jackson did for the everyman, the people he claimed to represent, as well as other maybe more negative decisions, and judge his presidency based on your background knowledge. If you're having some trouble or you find yourself automatically saying Jackson was a terrible, terrible person, go ahead and watch the TED video that's embedded in the notes. It's also available on the wiki. It gives you a good summary of Jackson good president, Jackson bad president, to give a more full response. And I will see you on Thursday.